I love literature. Um, so that for me is, those are, so that's for me one of the things that I'm trying to negotiate this thing. That's for me, one of the nice things, one of the things that we can take away from this very traumatic experience is being able to focus on the things that matter and slow down. I've seen many things online about this. And one of the things with poetry is it really does make you slow down. And it's an opportunity to read. I think what we as humanists sometimes feel is not only do we feel the need to try to teach people how to read, but we try to teach people that there is something called the act of reading, and it takes work. I mean, it's fun work, but reading itself is an activity. And as I've been saying to many of you here in relationship to Milton and the Renaissance really is a revolution in reading from many different perspectives. The Reformation is a revolution in reading. The scientific revolution that Francis Bacon is behind is a revolution in reading. Look at the world. And then, of course, Renaissance as a whole activity is a revolution in ways of understanding and ways of reading. Please feel free, by the way, whoever is here to interrupt me. So anyway, and that's talking about translation is really important when reading Lycidas, because the poem is, I guess with Milton, it's not only an act of translation. One really feels Milton's act of poetic appropriation. That is, Milton is not only bringing the classical to life, he's really taking it very much for himself. And in that sense, in some sense, that really defines what Milton does as a poet. As I said to you, he's not only important for what came after him in literary history, he's important for what became before, because everything gets reread through his lens. And that's no less true in relationship, it's certainly true in relationship to Paradise Lost, which is an appropriation of the story from Genesis, among many other things, Homer and Virgil. It's also true in this very short poem, or relatively short poem that Milton writes on the occasion of his, I was going to say friend, his classmate drowning, and in 1637, and his classmates put together a volume of poems, and Milton took this as an opportunity to write a poem about really his classmate, Edward King. But it's for Milton really an opportunity to meditate on death and loss. And he does that through several different languages. We'll see them: the Hebraic, the classical, and the Christian. And again, our assumption will be that even though we might not necessarily connect with Milton's beliefs, that there's something about this poem that can really be meaningful that we can take out of the poem. Anybody want to make any comments before we go on? Did you guys get the chance to read the poem? Yeah, take Vahader to go. I'm going to unmute everybody now.
It was,
yeah.
I found it difficult to understand. And I got all the references, but it was one of those, I know all these words individually, but your sentence doesn't make sense situation.
I didn't even get all the references, so you're a step ahead of me. And
most of them. I wouldn't say I got all of them.
Okay, well, you can place your humility aside for the moment. It's just very hard to follow all of the references. That's for sure. And while
that's how they work together.
That is surely true. But I think if one were to approach Milton's poems and think, in order to understand his poems, I have to understand all the references, you'd put the book down, because you'd never get through them. I'm just saying that's my experience. I still read through Paradise Lost, and I don't know many of the references. But I do appreciate what you're saying. It's a hard poem. It's not accessible in the same way as modern poetry would be accessible. And Milton really is, as we'll see, asking us to read in a certain kind of way. And I think this poem might also be about reading, about Milton finding. He wrote in Paradise Lost that he wanted to find his fit audience, though few. And I think all of Milton's poems are written for that possible fit audience. And he's writing poetry in some ways to be able to have an audience, or to create this fit audience, though few. Why is it few? Because he feels, or he's writing when he writes Paradise Lost at a time after the failure of the revolution, after, in Milton's mind, the failure of the English people, because they welcomed the king back. So for Milton, much of his poetry is about finding that right audience. Anybody else in my class or otherwise who wants to talk a little bit about how they read the poem or how they experienced the poem? Let's yeah, Stefan, yeah. Steph, yeah, nice to see you. Hello, Steph? No? Okay. You may talk, you may speak. This is the fun thing about Zoom classes, right? Trying to keep the momentum. So Steph, can you hear me, Steph? Okay, anyway, Steph, we can hear Steph. So let's start reading the poem. And I do encourage you. I've talked with my students about the ways in which Zoom classes in some way make us feel more isolated. You have no mic, Steph. And even though we're supposedly connecting with people all day long, in some ways we end the day and we're where we were in the morning with our computers. So I understand that in some sense, even though this is a real great form of connection, and I really feel it as such, I think we also just have to acknowledge that that this is it's a difficult pedagogical situation for us. So granted that, I'm really grateful for your participation, as it were.
Could I mention something quick?
Yeah, please.
So when I was reading over the poem, I found that it was broken up into like very specific, specifically detailed paragraphs. Like one paragraph was describing people, another paragraph was describing like actions, but they each focused on like something specific in each paragraph. Well,
yeah, go ahead.
There's like a sense of order in like this whole like unfathomable like.
Right, well, you're being very optimistic, and in the lecture that some of you may have seen, I did mention this, and just as really following from Talia's comment, this comment from Dr. Johnson, who is highly critical of Milton, and particularly of this poem. In this poem, he writes, "There is no nature, for there is no truth. There is no art, for there is nothing new. Its form is that of a pastoral, easy, vulgar, and therefore disgusting. Whatever images it can supply are long ago exhausted, and its inherent improbability always forces dissatisfaction on the mind. Nothing new, pastoral, easy, vulgar, and therefore disgusting." He explains further here, among the and this is what he really objects to, and this is kind of getting to what Talia was saying about there being so many different parts. Among the flocks and cuspids and flowers appear the heathen deities, Jove and Phoebus, Neptune and Aeolus, with a long train of mythological imagery such as a college easily supplies. He's basically saying, Johnson is saying that Milton was a little bit too high on himself after spending time at Cambridge. This because he's dropping names. This poem has yet a grosser fault. With these trifling fictions are mingled the most awful and sacred truths, such as ought never to be polluted with such irreverent combinations. You may remember Dr. Johnson talking about John Donne and criticizing his poetry for yoking the most heterogeneous ideas together. And Johnson here is essentially criticizing Lycidas for the same thing. He's mixing things that don't belong together. If you want to write a poem about the heathen gods, write a poem about the heathen gods, but don't mix it with Jesus and the Christian flock. Just as he said, remember when he's criticizing a valediction forbidding mourning, Dr. Johnson says of Donne's poem, who could possibly compare lovers and compasses? One of the interesting thing about really good misreadings, and Johnson's is a really good misreading, is it helps you it helps you to a good reading, to a better reading of the poem. But Johnson really points out what Talia is saying. I think there's another critic, a recent critic, who says that that Lycidas criticism is an attempt at holding disparate parts together that really don't belong together. So there's a long tradition in criticism of this poem that it's all over the place, that there's stuff that's unrelated to one another. So again, Johnson provides an into the poetry in that we will try to, in trying to understand Milton's perspective, we'll try to understand the perspective in which these things do go together, just as we did with Donne. And we finished reading a valediction forbidding mourning, and by the end of you start out with the poem and say, what could compasses have to do with lovers? And at the end of the poem, you say, of course, compasses and lovers. That's the brilliance of Donne's poetry. So we'll try to look at, to see if we can find similar things happening in Milton's poem. Fine. Here's this. Good. So he starts out here, Lycidas, this is added, I think, a little bit later, in this monody. A monody is a song in one voice, which, given Talia's comment and Johnson's comment, is very strange, because it seems like there are many voices in this poem. So it's strange that that Milton starts out calling it a monody. In this monody, the author bewails a learned friend, unfortunately drowned in his passage from Chester and the Irish seas, and by occasion foretells the ruin of our corrupted clergy then in their height. Oh, I didn't see this part. So not only is this a poem of loss, but it's also a poem which is writing about or mentioning the corruption of the religious elite. I don't know if anybody here can relate to such a thing. Living in Israel, can you relate to people wanting to criticize the religious elite? Right? So, what, Tuvia?
I was saying absolutely.
Absolutely, yeah. So, I mean, so when you passed it the first time, you might have thought, oh my God, this is going to be really boring. You know, we're talking about religion. But you see, Milton he speaks with a voice of a conviction, and every poem that he writes is always a political poem. Yet once more, O ye laurels, and what's more. That's a set of verses. Tikva, I'm sure you know this, a set of verses from Haggai. And in Haggai, it says, just on the bottom of this page, I think, according to the word that I covenant with you when he came out of Egypt, so my spirit remaineth among you. Fear not. For saith the Lord of hosts, yet once, it is less a little while, and I will shake the heavens and the earth and the sea and the dry land, and I will shake all nations, and the desire of all nations shall come, and I will fill this house with glory, saith the Lord of hosts. Some translations, I think this is the King James, say yet once more. So the language of Haggai is actually borrowed by Milton at the beginning of the poem, which in a way is announcing this kind of messianic framework for this poem. Haggai is talking about the end of days. So even in this, and this is how Milton works. On the one hand, he's very much in the moment, mourning his friend, and in some other voice, some of us can hear the yet once more of Haggai, which is not only about death, but about, I guess, death and loss, but eventual redemption. And God will shake the earth yet once more, so the things that are able to remain will remain. It's a lot for a first line of a poem, right? Meaning he's really compressing a lot there. It's not even compressed. It's elusive. And I think part of, as I was saying before, Milton is teaching us how to read his poem. And by the end of the poem, when we come back to the beginning, we know how to read the poem. Yet once more, and we see Haggai in the first line. Yet once more, O ye laurels, and once more, ye myrtles brown, with ivy ne'er sere, I come to pluck your berries harsh and crude, and with forced fingers rude shatter your leaves before the mellowing year. There's an idea that we've seen in Aeschylus and Homer and Shakespeare and Hamlet, this idea of ripeness. And here things are being destroyed, or ripeness is not happening. Death is happening before fruition, and with forced fingers rude the poet, shattering your leaves before the mellowing year. Bitter constraint and sad occasion, dear, compels me to disturb your season's due. For Lycidas is dead, dead ere his prime. Young Lycidas, and hath not left his peer. Who would not sing for Lycidas? He knew himself to sing and build the lofty rhyme. He must not float upon his watery bier unwept, and welter to the parching wind without the meed, the reward of some melodious tear. You just hear from the way I read it, how beautiful that is, how great that is, right? It's just, you know, some of you are poets, Janice, Stefan, right? You guys are poets. This is hard to do. But it's just, the way first, anybody having, so anybody, what is Milton doing in this first line, in this first stanza? I mean, who is the they of shatter your leaves before compels me to disturb your season due? Who is the author here? Who is the voice disturbing? Did people have that question? Yet once more, O ye laurels, and once more, I come to pluck your berries. Bitter constraint compels me to disturb your season due. I guess the berries, is that what it is? Kira, what are you thinking? Dr. Machete, yeah? Somebody, hello? I have to unmute you. All right, unmute you. Let's see. How do I do that? A lot of people are great. Unmute all.
Bill, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah, now I can. Great, yeah.
No, I was wondering before if Milton actually is one of those people that populated the Renaissance that actually saw reality through the scriptures, or if he's usually capable of distinguishing the two things as the two sides of a translation or of a metaphor. Is he fully conscious of the two sides and their difference, or is he just converging them, which is usually the dispute over like metaphysical poets? They're actually yoking together two dissimilar things, or is he how is he playing with the biblical, the Hebraic, the Hellenistic, and the Neo-Testamentarian, or whatever, the New Testament? How is he actually clashing them together, or is he juggling with them as separate categories?
What would you say?
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think I will give it. Sure, go ahead.
I think that he's fully conscious of their difference. But that's basically a full-fledged answer to Dr. Johnson, his misreader of Milton, saying, "Well, the guy's actually aware of what he's doing, but you're the one who's misreading him."
So I think that what you're saying is will be borne out. For me, I would translate this into other terms. We just did a little bit of academic talk, but I would translate it into other terms. The reason Milton is such a great poet in Paradise Lost, why he writes a successful theodicy, why he is able to justify the ways of God to man successfully. The reason his theodicy is successful is because it fails. Because a successful theodicy, by definition, will fail because it's too stupid. If it succeeds, it's turning reality into a cartoon. So even though, going back to what you're saying, and Milton allows in Paradise Lost for the possibility of the messianic story, but also the presence of evil. He does not erase the presence of evil. So in parallel terms, I would say, even though when we come back to the beginning of the poem, we will read this through Christian eyes or see how he can, nonetheless, we will continue to experience everything. Milton never erases any part of his experience. right? So, which means he doesn't erase l'allegro in relationship to il penseroso. He doesn't erase Satan in relationship to God. He's able to, even though he might prefer one of them, and there's one way of reading, but he'll never abandon the classical. And in this poem, he'll not abandon the Hebraic either. So he's calling, all right, so he's calling out and saying Lycidas is dead, and he himself, Lycidas, was a singer, was a poet, and Milton is wondering at the last two lines, three lines, and he must not float upon his watery bier unwept and welter to the parching wind without the meed of some melodious tear. And Lycidas, in a way, is enacting this, meaning Milton says, how can king go unwept? How can he go unmourned? As I said, this is a poem of both memory and mourning. And one of the consolations that mourning provides is poetry. And this is what happens in the next stanza. Begin then, sisters of the sacred well. And as Yaakov just said, we're going right into the classical realm. Begin then, sisters of the sacred well, that from beneath the seat of Jove doth spring.
Before we continue, may I?
Yeah.
So I kept on looking for hints of this, and then I finally looked at the psukim, and it is very reminiscent of what David says when David is mourning Jonathan and Saul.
So,
the structure of the poem is very similar.
Okay, so that's interesting, and that may, and if we talked about a lot, so that may be there, but I think right away, what we see right away is we've switched into this classical register. So I would want to put that aside just for the moment, because the question really is, of the first stanza, is there a consolation for loss? And the answer seems to come, or an answer seems to come right away. Begin then, sisters of the sacred well, that from beneath the seat of Jove the spring begin, and somewhat loudly sweep the string. Hence, with denial, vain and coy excuse, so may some gentle muse with lucky words favor my destined earned. And as he passes, turn and bid fair peace to my sable shroud. For we were nursed upon the self-same hill, fed the same flock by fountain, shade, and rill. Milton is doing what he habitually does as a poet, as he turns this is always about me. It's always about Milton. In a poem of mourning about his friend Edward King, it turns into a question about who is mourning me, who will remember me. Together,
perfect academic.
He's a perfect academic, right? We'll skip a little bit because otherwise we won't have time, and I want to make sure we get through the whole poem. So we go into this, I have to read it. Together both, back to 25, together both ere the high lawns appeared under the opening eyelids of the morn, we drove afield, for both shepherds, and both together heard what time the gray fly winds her sultry horn, battening our flocks with the fresh dews of night, oft till the star that rose at evening bright towards heaven's descent had sloped his western wheel up and down. Meanwhile, the rural ditties were not mute. Tempered to the oaten flute, rough satyrs danced and fawns with cloven heel. From that glad sound would not be absent long, and old Demetis loved to hear our song. Demetis might have been one of Milton's Cambridge tutors. So here Milton is singing with King, in the voice of King, in his own voice, but it's being mediated very clearly, as Yaakov, he keyed us to the whole poem from the beginning. It's being mediated through these classical images, or through the oaten flute, through the perspective or the point of view of the classics. But oh, the heavy change, now thou art gone. Now thou art gone and never must return. Thee, shepherd, thee, the woods and desert, caves with wild thyme and the gadding vine o'ergrown, and all their echoes mourn. The willows and the hazel copses green shall now no more be seen, fanning their joyous leaves to thy soft lays, as killing as the canker to the rose, or taintworm to the weanling herds that graze or frost to flowers, that their gay wardrobe wear when first the white thorn blows. such Lycidas, thy loss to shepherd's ear. Where were ye, nymphs, when the remorseless deep closed o'er the head of your loved Lycidas? For neither were you playing on the steep where your old bards, the famous Druids, lied, nor on the shaggy top of Mona High, nor yet where Diva spreads her wizard stream. I fondly dream. Had ye been there, for what could that have done? What could the muse herself that Orpheus bore, the muse herself, for her enchanting son whom universal nature did lament, when by the rout that made the hideous roar his gory visage down the stream was sent, down the sweet Hebrus to the Lesbian shore. What's Milton's claim against the nymphs? What should they have done?
They should have saved Lycidas. They're water spirits. That's kind of their thing.
So the water spirits should have kicked in and done their thing. You had one job to do, water spirits, and you did not do it. Okay, but he seems in the middle of the stanza to change, to give up on that. I mean, he says, I fondly dream." Why does the poet, or the voice of the poet here, why does he go from reproaching the nymphs to giving up on them? Had you been there, what could that have done? The music, Jakob, yeah.
Yes, I don't know if I should speak too much, but it feels like he's in the middle of the stanza. He's saying, well, the poem can't do much, but so the poem is a fond dream, because really the muses really couldn't have done much.
So I would start with the latter thing that you're saying, that the muses really can't do anything here. So Milton figures the muses, and then I would go back to what you were saying and emphasize the extent to which Milton is saying this form of poetry, this is not yet the right form of poetry. Because if I'm looking for a form of memory, if I'm looking for a form of commemoration, this poetry will not do. As we said at the beginning, Milton is appropriating multiple traditions. So at the same time that he inhabits it, he's also, as Jakob was pointing out, saying it can't really do that much. And here Milton will be explicit. Alas, or not Milton, the poet. Alas, what boots it, with uncessant care to tend the homely slighted shepherd's trade, and strictly meditate the thankless muse? Were it not better done as others use, to sport with Amaryllis in the shade, or with the tangles of Nerea's hair? Meaning, if you're going to be involved in the classical world, why bother being a poet? If you're going to live in that world, it would be much better to sport with Amaryllis in the shade, or with the tangles of Nerea's hair. That be involved in the beauty of the sensual, here of the feminine. The poet continues, fame is the spur that the clear spirit doth raise, that last infirmity of noble mind, to scorn delights and live laborious days. But the fair guerdon, what does that mean? But the fair reward, when he hoped to find and think to burst out into sudden blaze, comes the blind fury with the abhorred shears and slits the thin spun life. But not the praise, Phoebus replied, and touched my trembling ears. Fame is no plant that grows on mortal soil, nor in the glistering foil set off to the world, nor in broad rumor lies, but lives and spreads aloft by those pure eyes and perfect witness of all judging Jove, as he pronounces lastly on each deed, of so much fame in heaven expect thy need. So clearly, in this stanza. Milton, as Jakob is saying, is rejecting the vocation of the classical poet. First, from the point of the sensual, but then this other voice, and even though it's a monody, I spoke that voice, I think, in the voice that it has to be spoken, but not the praise, because it's a voice that's coming completely from outside of the stanza and the cultural sensibility that it represents. So the muse and the Greek world is being rejected. What's rejecting it? Or I'll put it in a different way. How can you say that the Greek world is being rejected here when it's Phoebus Apollo himself that is doing the rejecting, but not the praise Apollo Phoebus replied? And even when we have this idea that fame does not lie with men, but in heaven, we're told that it lies not only in heaven, but with all judging Jove. So how can you say, again, how can you say that the Greek is being rejected when the whole stanza, in fact, even the perspective that rejects Greek poetry is all Greek? Did that question make sense? Hello? Somebody's breathing? Take one, no. The question is, again, the Greek poetry is being rejected here. What's it being rejected by?
The Greek itself.
What does that mean? Oh no, right. You're repeating my question, right? So, but what in the second part of the stanza is different from the first part of the stanza? I mean, I think I just mentioned it. There's a distinction between fame as the last infirmity of noble mind and fame that is coming from heaven.
How does he define fame? Is fame used the same way today and then?
Fame is no plant, line 78. Fame is no plant that grows on mortal soil, nor in the glistering foil set off to the world, nor in broad rumor lies, but lives and spreads aloft by those pure eyes, and perfect witness of all judging Jove. So I can put it better now. In the first stanza, we thought, in the first part of the poem, the classical part of the poem, we think, what do you do in the face of death? You write a poem. And you write a poem to bring fame and glory to the deceased. That's how you recapture loss. But something about this stanza is already suggesting that that's not going to be sufficient. That the kind of fame that's associated with the Greek world and Greek poetry is not sufficient to this moment of remembrance. And so, and in answer to my question, I'll say really that even though the vehicle of the last part of the poem is all Greek, Phoebus, Job, nonetheless, it's still a kind of Judeo-Christian message that fame doesn't lie only with the Greek poet, with the limitations of the Greek, because they were pagans, but there's something more. So it is almost like, and this goes back to Talia's original insight, it's almost as like this other voice is intruding into this poem, into this stanza. It's like, shut up, Phoebus, you don't belong here. But Milton purposely like sticks his it in there. Yes, Tikva, yeah.
Yeah, okay, this may be stretching it a little, but I mean, Apollo is the god of the sun.
Yeah.
So it could be referring to Jesus, not only because Jesus is kind of portrayed with the sun behind his head, but also because
okay, so excellent.
Play on words.
So Tikva was actually helping with my argument in saying that this poem is teaching you how to read. That is, once you reach the end of the poem, you'll go back to this part of the poem and you'll read it that way as well. But going back to Jakob's original point and what makes this poem the complex and the endlessly complex poem that it is Milton does not erase the classical. The classical is still there. Even as it's rejected on some level, it's still present. Okay, so let's continue. Oh, fainted Arethusa. Is that a Fountain Arethusa, it's Greek, obviously. And thou honored flood, smooth sliding Mincius crowned with vocal reeds. That strain I heard was of a higher mood. It's almost as if the poet is saying, that last part of that stanza, that was of a higher mood. Let's get back to what we're good at. But now my ode proceeds and listens to the herald of the sea that came in Neptune's plea. He asked the waves and asked the felon winds, what hard mishap has doomed this gentle swain? And questioned every gust of rugged wings that blows from off each beaked promontory. They knew not of his story. And sage Hippotades their answer brings that not a blast was from his dudgeon strayed. The air was calm and on the level brine. Sleek Panope with all her sisters played. It was that fatal and perfidious bark, the boat, but in the eclipse, built in the eclipse and rigged with curses dark, that sunk so low, that sacred head of thine. There's a lot of up and down here. We're going down. In Joseph and his brothers, I'm reading that now, Thomas Mann, Joseph goes down to the pit. He goes down to Egypt. He keeps on going down and down and down. So here, there's this downward movement, but we'll pay attention to how it relates to later things. Next, Camus, Reverend Sire, I guess that's a river in England, went footing slow. Is that what it is, Camus? Somebody check me out here. Yeah. The river Cam. Next, Camus, Reverend Sire, went footing slow, his mantle hairy and his bonnet sedge, interwrought with figures dim, and on the edge liked to that sanguine flower inscribed with woe. Ah, who hath reft, quoth he, my dearest pledge, last came, my dearest pledge, last came, and last did go the pilot of the Galilean lake. I guess that's Peter? 2 massy keys he bore of metals twain, the golden opes, the iron shuts amain. He shook his mitred locks and stern bespake, how well could I have spared for thee, young swain, enough of such as for their bellies' sake creep and intrude and climb into the fold. Or other care, here the poet is switching from the pastoral to Peter, and Peter is now going into, remember the beginning of the poem, there was that promise of the critique of the contemporary clergy. Well, here it comes. Let's read it again. How well could I have spared, I could have used him now, for thee, young swain, enough of such as for their belly's sake creep and intrude and climb into the fold. So what Tikva was saying earlier about shepherds, the shepherds throughout this poem. And here Milton he's given us images. We have images of the good shepherd, Milton and King, and here are images of the bad shepherd. What do? They creep and intrude and climb into the fold. Or other care they little reckoning make than how to scramble at the shearer's feast and shove away the worthy bidden guest. Blind mouths. That's a great poetic image, right? A lot of ink been spent on that one. Blind mouths. So blindness, the shepherd is supposed to see, and he's blind, and the preacher is supposed to preach, and his mouth is blind. Blind mouths that scarce themselves now to hold a sheep hook. That's great, isn't that? Isn't that a great critique of the contemporary clergy, right? They don't even know how to hold a sheep hook. It's very often what happens when you have a corrupt clergy is they're completely divorced from reality. Tuvia's nodding, right? You know what I'm talking about. Tuvia lives in Ramat Gan, which is very close to Bnei Brak. Right? They scarce themselves know how to hold a sheep hook or have learned aught else, the least that to the faithful herdman's art belongs. If you want to be a shepherd, you have to work at it. What recks it them? What needs they? They are sped, and when they list their lean and flashy songs grate on their scrannel pipes of wretched straw, the hungry sheep look up and are not fed, but swollen with wind and the rank mist they draw, rot inwardly, and foul contagion spread. So if you want to look at a metaphor for religious corruption and the way it spreads, I mean, God, this is really Milton in the time of Corona, isn't it? But swollen with wind and rank mist, they draw rot inwardly, and foul contagion spread. Contagion, anyone? Social distancing, anyone? Right? besides what the grim wolf with privy paw daily devours apace, and nothing said. But that two-handed engine at the door stands ready to smite once and smite no more. These two lines are maybe the two most discussed lines in English poetry, I kid you not, because nobody really knows what the two-handed engine is. Whatever it is, it's this very, very scary thing, which seems to be it's like a New Testament version of Haggai. Haggai says, yet once more, and the world will be renewed. Here it's but that two-handed engine at the door. I think somebody says Peter's keys. That two-handed engine at the door stands ready to smite once and smite no more, right? It's interesting. If the first few stanzas are a Greek perspective, I mean, this is also, how would we describe this stanza? Is it Christian? That seems to be.
He seems to seamlessly move into actuality.
You're breaking up, Jakob. I can't hear you.
He's moved into Inyane de Yoma, meaning he's just dealing with the things that are important and urgent for him to deal with. But he's doing that with a language of right, of the classical lexicon that he adopted at the beginning, but it somehow is dealing with the church, and it's seamlessly merging with discussions on ecclesial dynamics and all that.
That's so interesting, because really, that's my grandson. We're tri-generational here in our quarantine, so that's you get to hear that. I didn't even notice. Yaakov points out that I just read this as Christian, or maybe kind of Old Testament Jewish from Milton's point of view, because it's really about, especially at the end, it's about justice, the end, smite once and smite no more. But Yaakov really points out that it all is still through the vehicle of the Greek.
Right, we're still with the shepherds, and I'm still kind of stuck with the pastoral, so he's still in the pastoral, and the sheeps and the shepherds and the sheep. But somehow now we moved into that kind of ecclesiastical, religious, theological, whatever, Christian.
But he's very much still using the pastoral world. Remember Dr. Johnson? Dr. Johnson freaks out. Why does he freak out? Because he doesn't like the mixing up of stuff. Don't mix stuff up. You don't put even critique of the church and shepherds and sheep and shearers in the same stanza. So it's again that kind of Johnsonian critique of the mixing up of things. But for some reason, for Milton, this seems to be intrinsic to what he's doing. Meaning for Milton, you cannot write about the Christian without the classical. You don't erase the classical. It's still there. It's still a resource of some sort. Yes, Tikva.
This could just be the excessive biblical education, but to me, the pastoral doesn't feel like this whole shepherd thing feels much more biblical than it does it does classical. I mean,
in this stance,
there's definitely, I'm pretty sure there's something in Jeremiah about false prophets leading people astray. And being like
so there are definitely biblical precedents for the bad shepherds. Let me just interrupt you, Tikva, but I think that's a really great insight that these shepherds look like Old Testament shepherds. So and not just from the point of view of the muse. So maybe that's another insight, really, that where the beginning of the poem seems to focus on the classical, the sensibility of this part of the poem, or at least there's some poetic weight to this part of the poem, which is located in Tanakh in the Old Testament. And also the God from Milton's perspective of law, or of justice. And now the poet sings again. It's almost like he's out of breath. Return, Alpheus, the dread voice is past. Meaning, whatever just happened in the previous stanza, please, Greek muse, come back to me, because that was too scary. Return, Alpheus, the dread voice is past. that shrunk thy streams. Return, Sicilian muse, and call the vales, and bid them hither cast their bells and florets of 1,000 hues. Ye valleys, low, where the mild whispers use of shades and wanted winds and gushing brooks, on whose fresh lap the swart star sparely looks. Throw hither all your quaint, enameled eyes, that on the green turf suck the honeyed showers, and purple all the ground with vernal flowers. Bring the wrath primrose that forsaken dies, the tufted croto and pale gethsemane, the white pink and the pansy freaked with jet, the glowing violet, the musk rose and the well-attired woodbine with cowslips wen that hang their pensive head, and every flower that sad embroidery wears. Bid amaranthus all his beauty shed, and daffodils fill their cup with tears. To strew the laureate hearse where Lycid lies, for to interspose a little ease, let our frail thoughts dally with false surmise, I me. While thee the shores and sounding seas wash far away, where'er thy bones are hurled, whether beyond the stormy Hebrides, where thou perhaps under the whelming tide visits the bottom of the monstrous world, or whether thou, to our moist vows denied, sleepest by the fable of Bellerus old, where the great vision of the guarded mount looks towards Damankus and Beana's hold. Look homeward, angel, now, and melt with ruth, and O ye dolphins, waft the helpless youth. Wow, just crazy, right? So it starts out with return to nature, nature first as fecund, beautiful, then things become pensive, sad, beauty shedding, tears. It's not surprising that we find ourselves going down the bottom of the monstrous world, that the movement of the poem, even as it's trying to go up, even as we're trying to, as the classical world is doing its best to praise the dead Lycidas, to provide some consolation, there is still this sense of, at least given the resources that the classical world offers, there's still this tremendous sense of loss. Look homeward, angel, now, and melt with ruth. That's like pity. And O ye dolphins, waft the hapless youth. Weep no more. Weep no more, woeful shepherds. Weep no more. We go from yet once more to weep no more. Yet once more, remember, in Haggai is the Messianic age, but the Messianic age of the Jews. When we hear about it again, it's associated with smiting and smiting once more in death. But here, there's another shepherd. Weep no more, woeful shepherds, weep no more. For Lycidas, your sorrow is not dead, sunk, though he be beneath the watery floor. So sinks the day star in the ocean bed, and yet anon it repairs his drooping head, and tricks his beams, and with new spangled or flames in the forehead of the morning sky. So Lycidas sunk low, but mounted high, through the dear might of him that walked the waves, where other groves and other streams, along with nectar pure, his oozy locks he laves, and hears the unexpressive nuptial song in the blessed kingdoms, meek of joy and love. There entertain him all the saints above in solemn truths and sweet societies that sing, and singing in their glory move and wipe the tears forever from his eyes. Now, Lycidas, the shepherds weep no more. Henceforth, thou art the genius of the shore, the genius of the place. In thy large recompense, and shalt be good to all that wander in that perilous flood. Thus sang the uncouth swain. You see what Milton is doing at the end of the poem? He's saying, that wasn't me. That was another voice. And he's calling him the uncouth swain. Thus sang the uncouth swain to the oaks and rills, while the still morn went out with sandals gray. He touched the tender stops of various quills, with eager thought warbling his Doric lay. And now the sun had stretched out all the hills, and now was dropped into the western bay. At last he rose, and twitched his mantle blue. Tomorrow to fresh woods and pastures new. You see why people write books about this poem, right? You know, I was talking to some graduate students yesterday. We were talking about being a dumb reader. And being a dumb reader is not such a bad thing to be a dumb reader. Being a dumb reader, we were talking about like novels or stories. When you're a dumb reader, you just kind of go with the story. And then later on somebody says, well, you know, they ask if you got a certain part of it, and you're like, no. Which happens to me all the time, especially when I read novels, because I just read for the story all the time. There's part of that here. I mean, I just think there's reading just for the emotional momentum that this poem creates just as you read it. Even if you don't understand it fully, there's something about the music of it that just pushes you to the end, and that experience itself is so satisfying. And then but then you have to go back the next step and think, well, what actually happened here? Maybe I'll just start by asking, I'll ask a really dumb question. Is this a happy ending? These last two lines, I just love these last two lines. At last he rose and twitched his mantle blue, tomorrow to fresh woods and pastures blue. I don't know why I love it so much, but it's just like so powerful. And to me, it's so powerful in its simplicity. I don't know. Anyway, happy ending or not? Happy ending or sad ending? Come on, be brave. It's Passover. It's all extra credit. Yes, Kira, yeah. Kira, you got to talk, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, no, my mute is far from me.
No, it unmutes it. It's voice activated, I think, for everybody else.
Oh,
I think. Maybe I'm wrong. I have no idea.
Yeah,
you know better than I
do. Yeah, I get like I wouldn't call it either. Like I don't feel happy reading the end of it, but it feels hopeful. Yeah, I don't know if I have anything more intelligent to say than that.
That was perfectly intelligent. Anybody else want to say something intelligent or not intelligent?
Can I say something?
Please, Janice, yeah.
It seems strange because for the entire poem he's talking about how awful it is that this guy died young and everything, and then the last two lines are almost like a totally different mood.
Yeah, the last lines are complete. I mean, for sure the last two lines, but when he announces in the last stanza, that wasn't me. Thus saith the uncouth swain. So, I mean, Milton gets to, I mean, we often talk about the distinction between the voice of the poet and the voice of the poem. And here that's actually happening in the poem. And Milton is able to say the person who said that was an uncouth swain, which must mean to some extent that he didn't know what he was saying. He didn't understand the full extent of what he was saying.
Is there sort of criticism of God or something?
I don't know if we would look for that. I mean, I think first, what is poetry is not a consolation, or a certain kind of classical poetry is not a consolation. What is the right kind of poetry? What is because classical poetry, as beautiful as it is, I'd rather sport with, Amaryllis in the shade. So what is the poetry that actually will provide consolation?
Christian poetry?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think actually it's this poem. I think Milton is saying this is the poem. If you want to know what kind of poetry is appropriate to mourning you, it's this. Now, Lycidas, the shepherds weep no more. Henceforth, thou art the genius of the shore in thy large recompense, and shalt be good to all that wander in the perilous flood. Meaning, you will be the genius of the shore. What does genius of the shore mean? Like, what does it mean?
Guardian.
Right. So you'll be the guardian. And the way we know, and you will, and shalt be good to all that wander in that perilous flood. What is that perilous flood? Life.
Tradition.
Pardon?
Tradition.
I would say I would just say it's life, and shalt be good to all that wander in that perilous flood. That perilous flood being life as we know it. Life is that perilous flood. And now, Lycidas, you are the guide.
Wouldn't it be,
Well, let me just finish here. And now,
sorry.
Lycidas, you are the guide, but Lycidas only exists through this poem. So the guide then becomes, how do I get through this perilous flood? Which for me always will be in relationship to Milton, is how do I learn how to read properly the world in which I live? I have to read this poem. When I read this poem properly, then I will know how to read. Yes, Tikva. I'm being a strong reader here because I did promise an hour, and I just want to give some kind of closure here. I have more to say, but go ahead, Tikva. Yeah.
Oh, I just I mean, obviously this is a pastoral poem, and obviously there are references to the Song of Songs, and I'll shut up about that.
Excellent. Right.
But there's also, this is very reminiscent. I think it's the second chapter of Tzfania, where like there's
Tzfania for the win.
Here.
Okay.
Yeah, I think.
Okay. So Tikva, I'm going to put that into my toolbox. But I think you're right, really. Your previous emphasis on this second part as being so suffused with the Old Testament, and the Old Testament version of the shepherd. So we have, in the first set of stanzas, the classical shepherdess poet. In the second set of stanzas, we have the Hebraic shepherd, because as you guys pointed out, we just hear David, we hear the patriarchs in the second part. And it's also associated with, for Milton, with justice. And then in the last stanza, weep no more. It's obviously, here we have, we can just go through it. It's down and up. Down not only just means down. Down and death means going up. Down and death means also the possibility of redemption. So, we'll read it again. So Lycidas sunk low but mounted high, through the dear might of him that walked the waves. Another shepherd, Jesus, where other groves and other streams, along with nectar pure, his oozy locks he laves, and hears the inexpressible nuptial song in the blessed kingdoms meek of joy and love. There entertain him all the saints above in solemn troops and sweet society that sing, and singing in their glory move and wipe the tears forever from his eyes. I think it's wipe the tears forever from his eyes, but maybe not ours. Meaning, even as Milton accommodates this world of redemption, I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to make good on what Tali and Yaakov said earlier about all the parts being held in place. And I think when I asked you before whether this is a happy ending, and we kind of feel that it's not, even though this redemption here is present and the movement down goes up, there's still that sense of mourning, and wipe the tears forever from his eyes. Now, Lycidas, the shepherds, weep no more. Henceforth thou art the genius of the shore, in thy large recompense, and shall be good to all that wander in the perilous flood.
Well, isn't he it's kind of a bittersweet thing, no? Because he's saying on one hand, like, Lycidas isn't truly dead, he's, out there, protecting us and guiding us in the flood. But on the other hand, he's not here with us. So we're not mourning. I mean, that was one of the things I heard a lot, at least, about, like,
right.
It's sad for us, but it's not sad for the dead person.
Well, I mean, we're still in that perilous flood. What does Milton gain by calling this guy the uncouth swain? And how is this related? We're concluding now. How is this related to the the criticism that has persisted for centuries about this poem being a grab bag of stuff that really doesn't hold together. One more time. What does Milton, we're going to ask the question again just so everybody hears it. One question is, what does Milton gain by calling the poet an uncouth swain? And how does that relate, or may it answer the question of why for generations people have rejected this poem for being disorganized, vulgar, a grab bag? That's what Johnson is essentially saying, and critics up until this day say that. How does Milton calling him the uncouth swain maybe help solve that? And also think in terms of Milton calls it in 1637 or later on when he publishes it a monody, which is so clearly against our experience, a monody being in one voice. Why does Milton kind of like, it's almost like he's hitting over the reader over the head and saying, I know you're not going to experience this as a monody, but that's what it is, it's one voice. So those are my two questions. How does the uncouth swain, and how does that help maybe in answering the critique of people since Dr. Johnson?
You can read it through Dunn and say that it's two that are one.
Can you for the not entirely initiated, Dr. Machete, can you tell us what you mean?
That the uncouth swain is a voice that performs within Milton, and that he's not dissociating himself from it, but he's just putting it aside and saying, this is the other side of me, and there's this alchemical, whatever you want to call it, this refining alembic that keeps boiling traditions together and trying to bring a kind of a quintessence out of it. That's
very cool. Go ahead.
And then on the other hand, there's the other voice which sees that as just useless, or basically extraneous, a different voice within himself. So it's two that are one. It's two voices within one monody.
I love what you're saying about the different traditions being spoken out here, and the possibility. I mean, I would emphasize a little bit differently. I mean, what I'm saying is presupposed, is based upon what Jakob was saying, is that it's not only about molding the traditions, it's about creating the reader. If the uncouth swain doesn't know what he's saying, who does? And I think the answer is a good reader. Meaning the uncouth, and this is going back to the first point that Jakob made, the uncouth swain, when he reads the first line, when he says the first line, the uncouth swain does not know what he's saying. He does not know Chagai, or he doesn't know. Only we, as I said to you when we started reading the poem, when we finish the whole poem, we'll know how to read the first line. When we finish the whole poem, we see what the first line is doing. We see how much is present there. And what Jakob was saying is we never, and when we get to Phoebus and Jove, we know after we read the end of the poem, of course Phoebus is, as Tifa said, a figure in some sense of Jesus. Of course Jove is the Old Testament God. So we keep on reading through the poem and seeing the possibilities of more and more layers there. And again, as we said, and Jakob just emphasized, is we never, in Milton, nothing is ever erased. It's always still there. It's always part of the process of meaning. So the uncouth swain, it's almost as if the classical world, this was very common in the 17th and 18th century, it's also common in Dante and Augustine, to look back at the world of the Old Testament and the classical world and to think, well, like Augustine says, Moses really knew all about Jesus, right? Because there was an angel whispering in his ear when he was wherever he was, on Har Sinai. So either the Old Testament prophets know, or they have this kind of theological unconscious that expresses itself in their words, and they're not aware of it. And in some sense, that's what Milton is doing here. That there's this consciousness, even, and this is why you rescue the classics as well, right? You go back and you say they knew on some level, It was already there on some level.
Can I add something?
Yeah, please. Elon, welcome. Yeah.
I'm just thinking the Uncle Swain affected by the muses, kind of under an hypnotic state.
He's in a hypnotic state?
He's not fully aware of what he's actually doing. What he's actually doing or saying.
So he's kind
and
of like,
then in the last stanza, he says that somebody else said that after he's awake and okay, something happened here and I didn't have any control on the situation.
Right. I mean, I think it's, I mean, you're kind of reading him like an Old Testament, in the same way that you might read an Old Testament prophet. Let's just continue. Let's, that he has more knowledge than he has less knowledge than he seems to, or he shows more knowledge in what he says than he actually knows. Let's just conclude with these last two lines again. At last he rose. Who's being described here? The uncouth swain. The uncouth swain, he was sitting or lying down. At last he rose and twitched his mantle blue. Tomorrow to fresh woods and pastures. So the last two lines, really, as somebody said earlier, it switches to an entirely different register. We're back to pastoral. The twitching of his mantle blue, the fresh woods, the pastures. We're back to the simplicity of pastoral. And even there, at last he rose. How do we read that as readers? It's obviously Christian, right? At last he rose, and and twitched his mantle blue. Tomorrow to fresh woods and pastures new. And I think again, what's interesting and so distinctive about Milton is that yes, you get the Christian voice at the very beginning, but the poem, and I think this is what you maybe were saying earlier, the poem doesn't end with the image of Christian salvation. We're back in the pastoral, where we're not in the perilous flood. That's interesting. Tomorrow to fresh woods and pastures new. Meaning perhaps, and maybe this is a way of reading the poem, is once we know how to read the poem, we do feel consolation. We feel the consolation of this poetry. We're not in the perilous flood, but we're also not in some after time in which everything is great. Milton ends the poem in history, in the pastoral clean of the Christian. I mean, you get the first four words of that last two lines, you have the Christian, but everything after that, we're back in pastoral, back in the world, and the pastoral is this world. And twitched his mantle blue, tomorrow to fresh woods and pastures new. And perhaps the consolation of Lycidas is that we don't end in the perilous flood, but we end in the possibility of pastures new, fresh woods and pastures new. Does somebody read that as Christian at the end? No, it's Virgilian, right? It's from Virgil. So people, I know Tiffany, you have another comment, but I wanted to do any comments on our reading of the poem? Did people enjoy reading the poem now? Were you being polite by staying here for the past hour, or were you actually interested in reading the poem? It's a kind of writing that certainly challenges us. It challenges us, just to go back where we started. It challenges us because it's so difficult and so foreign, but it also challenges us because if we're good readers of Milton, if we're good readers of anybody, we don't reject them because they don't share all of our assumptions and presuppositions. And we can even perhaps learn from people without our assumptions and presuppositions. And even though we don't accept, or some of us don't, or all of us don't, the Christian presuppositions that end the poem, that idea of Christian redemption, take away the Christian machinery, which I know Milton doesn't want you to do, but take away the Christian machinery, and there is still this possibility of a notion of time that transcends our experience of the physical and the everyday. And there is a notion, or Milton, and here this is translating into an entire different register, is allowing for the possibility of poetry, which allows for which hints at the divine. Certainly, that's what the Romantic poets look back at Milton for his individuality. Apparently, there's a story that Ralph Waldo Emerson was on a ship from Europe to America, and they were for 3 days. They thought they were going to die because the storms were so bad. And he read Lycidas over and over. He didn't read it. He knew it from memory. He knew it from memory. So it's a poem that both acknowledges despair, the perilous flood, but also hope. Why read poetry anymore? Who would bother with poetry, right? I mean, yes, Jacob, yeah.
There's this great line, and I think that Milton is actually thinking in this very Erasmian manner. And there's this great line
not for only the initiated.
Right. For Erasmus, Desiderius Erasmus, one of the greatest humanists. So Erasmus writes in a letter, and I had to look this up. He says, "No man can rightly call himself a theologian and proceed to lecture on the scriptures and expound them in public before he is sure that he has duly washed his hands in every fountain of the muses."
Yeah,
so it's like the two things come together very, very clearly in Erasmus. And also in Milton, I mean, he just says, you can't, there's a lot of water also in this poem. And you start with the muses and the founts and all that, and then it becomes a perilous flood. And you really can't deal with tradition, with the scriptures, with anything, if you don't see it through the classical tradition, and you don't bring the two things together.
If you don't, I mean, that makes that makes the critique of the religious elite even stronger, because they may be discouraging people from looking at things other than from a purely theological lens. And Milton seems to be saying that the most theologically serious, the people who love God the most, are the people who love all of his creations, including the classical and Hebraic.
Well, you want to get a clear picture of reality, you have to look at it through a kaleidoscope.
That's a nice. In order to be clear, you have to see things through a kaleidoscope. That's very Miltonic, right? One of Milton's favorite words is "or." Anybody else wanted to chime in before we close off our special Passover edition?
Yeah, one more thing.
Yeah, Janice, yeah.
Is there something about art and life in this poem, or am I just...
Are you reading in the 19th century into the 17th century? What's the art and life that you see here?
Well, if Lycidas is like a poet, or he sings, or...
Oh, for sure.
He dies, and then it's sort of this contrast, what lives on after he goes.
So I shouldn't have made fun of you like that, because really one of the main obsessions of the Renaissance is art and artifice. And as I was suggesting earlier, the poem the guidance that's offered is the poem itself. I think every great poem in the Renaissance, I'm just totally generalizing about a lot of things right now. Every great poem in the Renaissance is a defense of poetry. Who's going to catch me on that one? Certainly you can think of a lot of great poems in the Renaissance that are kinds of defenses of poetry. And this is a defense of poetry. And there is certainly throughout the Renaissance this tension between art and life, and the way art and artifice for many writers takes precedence, and Milton certainly among them.
Yay for tea. Save the day.
Is somebody else talking now, or is it somebody talking to their child? Tikva, did you have another comment?
Of course, we remember.
Several. I'll try to keep it short.
Let's go. Let's say people want to eat dinner, and their refreshments are getting cold. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, I think then about the, I know this is a while back, but when we talked about it being like a sack full of really random things. I think that that's very reflective of mourning and the process of losing someone, where there's this spiritual aspect of God, what on earth are you doing? And then there's this practical aspect of flip, I have to plan a funeral. And there's this emotional complete menagerie, and the confusion and the disarray of the poem is very reflective of the confusion and disarray that is lost.
That's a beautiful point. Yeah, that's nice. Steph, does your mic work yet? No. Okay, well, really, thank you everybody for coming. Anybody want to share any coronavirus stories? Quarantine, hopefully not virus stories, like quarantine stories?
I get out of quarantine tomorrow. Very exciting.
Yay.
Yeah.
You must be very excited. You've been in quarantine for how long?
I'm not really sure what to do with myself when I'm not stuck in my bedroom, to be honest. I've been here for 10 days.
Uh-huh. Fresh pastures. You'll go out of your room.
That's the plan.
Try 3 weeks.
What did you say, Elon? What did you say?
I'm stuck at home for like 3 or 4 weeks already.
Are you with family?
Yeah.
Yeah, then you have less reason to complain than I do. I'm stuck in my dorm for over 3 weeks and I don't have anybody here. So.
Right. I mean, I was stuck in the dorms for a month by myself, and then I came home so I could be with my family for Pesach, but I had to be in isolation to protect my parents. So, because of in the dorms, you go shopping in Bnei Brak, and in Bnei Brak, a lot of people are sick.
Whoopsie.
Now the Mega had, I think less than a week ago, the Mega had a case of exposure.
For heaven's sake.
Yep.
Fun times.
Right. So that's there are very, very big and different challenges for different people. Yeah. So that's why I had this idea, but it doesn't really work with Zoom. It works better with team viewers. I had this idea of having like a coffee shop open online where people like students from Bar Ilan could get together, but it all depended on my Zoom session being open, and it would go off right when I went at night. So I just wasn't really scrupulous about that. But maybe I'll do that again so we can. I just find it's very nice to connect, and I encourage my students to have office hours with me, which is something I never really do. On my office door, I have that New Yorker cartoon, which says the picture of the guy with his date book open, and he's on the phone, and he says, "How about never?" That's on my office door. But right now, I'm really I'm welcoming the connection. So I think we should reach out to, especially if you know people who need to be reached out to. If you can do that on Zoom or in any other way that's possible, it's very, very important. I know especially a lot of Bar Ilan undergraduates like Tuvia are in situations which are not ideal or optimal. And this is very difficult, and even though we do have this contact, it's very, very different than the kind of contact that we have in a face-to-face, or even just body to body, where you can just sense from somebody's vibe where they are or how they're doing.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
No, I know you said the coffee shop didn't really work. Is there? I don't know. I am very bad at technology. Is there some way to do like a movie night of the English literature department?
We could do that.
Finally watch the Monty Python and the Holy Grail.
That would be illegal. We could screen it for a Zoom audience, and we could have running commentary in the chat. That is an excellent idea, Tikva. We should do that. We have to choose the film, though.
Monty Python and the Holy Grail.
And someone with an unlimited account.
Right. No, I have the unlimited account. That's the beauty of it. Are you guys listening to all the classical music that's available online and seeing all? Apparently, there's Jane Eyre at the National Theater, which is supposed to be stupendously good, which is on YouTube now. So that's that.
I've been scrolling through all the academic databases we have access to.
That's really nerdy. That's really nerdy.
I am very nerdy. Do I claim otherwise?
So they're academic
I mean,
databases,
we have like access to stuff we'll never have access to again. It's amazing.
right. And Dr. Machete pointed out to me that there is the Berlin Philharmonic is online now. Their digital platform you can go on for a month, and it's really stupendously amazing. You should watch it.
Yeah.
And the Metropolitan Opera is also, every night they have a new opera. The Vienna State Opera also does. The New York, the New York, and RC, the RC has a Hamlet with a woman's star, which I have no objections to, but it did not look like a great production. But
they've been doing like watching old productions online.
For sure,
like
right. They're putting stuff up. There's the Met now today is doing Mozart's Casi fan tutte, which is really just it's uplifting. I recommend it highly. It's only available like for a day, so you have to catch it. Shall I tell you an inspirational story about creativity that Kira has already heard? You don't care. You can go. Yeah, I'm not insulted if you need to go now. So God, thank you for coming. Here's the inspirational story about creativity. So one of the things that I've been watching on the Berlin Philharmonic platform, which Jakob told me about, is Claudio Abbado, who was the head of the orchestra between 1992 and 2002. And he came after Herbert von Karajan, who in politics and also in musical style, or especially in conducting style, was an authoritarian figure. They were terrified of him. In fact, the players would say that every rehearsal was like a concert. And part of one of the things that's available online, there's a documentary about Abbado, and there's also a section on the for the last concert of his career that it's now online, of some of the players in his orchestra remembering him, and they remember him very, very clearly in contrast to von Karajan, the authoritarian personality, versus Abbado, who is just in every possible way this democratic personality. So one of the harpsichord players said, I never understood things because all the rehearsals were so disorganized, but the performances were always so amazing. And she said, I thought it was a fault in him, and I never understood it. And she said also, and part of because he was so disorganized, like we had to arrange in our groups, first violin, second violins, woodwinds, and we had to do things on our own. So later on in the same film, there's another guy, and he says, I have a very different theory than most of my colleagues. I think he did it on purpose, meaning he did it because he's working with the most proficient players in the world, right? And he's saying to them, you do it, right? Take the time and be creative on your own. And what happens is, because these people are their expertise is on such a high level, is that when they do what they're able to also do is when they get together as an orchestra, they talk to each other.
Good to see you.
And that's the greatness of great orchestras, is like the greatness of great rock and roll bands. They listen to each other and they talk to each other. And that's what you see in the Berlin Philharmonic under Abbado, is that these people are all talking to each other. So that's a lesson for teachers, I think, and you guys probably are all in some way or another teachers, of respecting, of giving people the space to be creative, because we don't want followers, we want leaders, right? We don't want, if we're teaching poetry, we don't want people who are following our style. We want people who are being inventive. We're teaching scholars. We don't want people who are versions of us. Some people are like that, but we want people who are independent. If you're teaching high school students, it's the same thing, right? So because Jakob and I were talking about the extent to which you can learn so much about pedagogy from watching different conductors and how they deal with giving people the space for communicating. So I will leave you with that. Bye. Have a happy Pesach. Chag Sameach. See you guys.
Bye.
Bye. Jakob, thank you for participating. Appreciated that.
Yeah.
Okay. Stop share and meeting for all.